As explosions lit up the sky, the soldiers inside the compound scrambled into position, their weapons raised. Yet Ethan Ward, lying on a cot in the back corner of the makeshift command post, didn't stir. He'd been like this for hours, perfectly still, eyes closed, one arm hanging off the edge of his bunk, as if he were simply napping. A few meters away, Sergeant Jake Sullivan kicked a battered table, sending a rattling noise through the room. "Damn it, Ward, wake up. You're gonna get us all killed if you keep." But before he could finish, the building shook violently as another artillery shell struck the perimeter. Dust fell from the cracked ceiling, and the lights flickered. Yet through the chaos, Ethan didn't even twitch. His breathing remained steady, slow, like he was in the comfort of his own home, not in the middle of a war zone where death came as often as the wind. "He's not human," whispered Private Luis Fernandez, his voice barely audible over the groans of the structure. "No one sleeps through this. No one." Lieutenant Sam Taylor shook his head, eyes narrowed. He had seen a lot of things in his years in the Federation military, but Ethan Ward was something different. Human soldiers were tough, sure. But this was something else. As the sound of approaching Krosh war machines rumbled closer, the unit moved into their battle positions. The Krosh, a terrifying alien species known for their ruthless tactics and towering forms, would attack soon. Their elite shock troops were among the best in the galaxy, and yet they'd failed to break the human line several times in the last few weeks. "Keep your heads down, everyone," Taylor ordered, gripping his rifle tighter. "The moment they breach the outer wall, we fight." And Ward, he glanced over at Ethan, still dead to the world. "We'll keep fighting, even if he sleeps through the whole damn thing." This builds the tension, focusing on the mysterious nature of Ethan's calm and the growing unease of his fellow soldiers. There's a clear sense of foreboding as they brace for the upcoming assault, setting the stage for Ethan's strange role in the battle. The rumble of the Krosh war machines grew louder, vibrating through the floor like the tremors of an impending earthquake. As the rest of the unit prepared for the oncoming assault, the tension in the air was palpable, except for one soldier. Ethan Ward continued to sleep, oblivious to the world falling apart around him. His uniform was tattered, his face shadowed by stubble, but his calmness was uncanny. Outside, the Krosh forces were closing in. Their heavily armored walkers, spider-legged behemoths that could crush a man with a single stomp, were advancing through the war-torn landscape. The sky overhead was streaked with smoke from earlier bombardments, and every few seconds, another distant explosion would send a shockwave through the ground. Yet Ethan didn't budge. Kimorath, the Krosh warlord leading the assault, eyed the compound from a distance. His senses, sharpened over centuries of war, tingled with an odd sense of unease. The human defenses had been holding strong. Federation forces had fought tooth and nail, refusing to retreat. But this wasn't what worried Kimorath. It was him, the human soldier who had defied every expectation. The sleeping titan. Word had spread among the Krosh ranks about Ethan's peculiar ability to remain unfazed in the midst of unimaginable violence. Kimorath didn't believe it at first, but the reports kept coming in. The humans slept through artillery strikes, chemical clouds, and even close-quarters combat. The very idea of it was anathema to everything Kimorath knew about warfare. "Send in the scouts." Kimorath commanded his second-in-command, a battle-hardened Krosh named Varuk. "I want to see if this myth is true." Varuk hesitated. "Warlord, are you sure? If this is a trap." "I don't care," Kimorath growled. "I want to see the human for myself." The tension was building as the Krosh elite began to infiltrate the compound, their heavy boots muffled by the thick layer of dust. Ethan's stillness was an eerie calm, but it was beginning to gnaw at the minds of the invaders. Would the legend prove true? Would the human really sleep through this assault? The Krosh scouts, trained to be both silent and deadly, moved like shadows through the broken ruins of the compound. They circled the outer edges, creeping closer to the structure where Ethan Ward lay. Their multi-lensed eyes darted from corner to corner, ever watchful for movement, ever ready to strike. Yet, despite their keen senses, the one thing they didn't anticipate was the absence of movement. Inside the compound, the rest of the Federation soldiers were bracing for the inevitable confrontation. Sergeant Jake Sullivan stood near the doorway, rifle clenched in his hands, sweat beading on his brow. He glanced back at Ethan's cot, where the human soldier still slept soundly, unfazed by the noise of distant explosions or the faint tremor of the building as it rattled from enemy fire. "He's gonna get us killed," Sullivan muttered under his breath, though part of him felt a strange respect for the man. Even now, as the Trosh pushed closer, Ethan seemed to emit an aura of calm that no one else could replicate. It was almost as if he wasn't part of this war, as though, in his mind, it were just another day in the park. Lieutenant Sam Taylor crouched next to Sullivan, his face drawn and tired, eyes scanning the perimeter. "We've been through worse," he said, his voice a low growl. "Ethan's different, sure, but when it comes down to it, he'll fight. He always does." Sullivan nodded, but his gaze remained locked on Ethan. "But does he fight if he doesn't wake up?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the scouts closed in. The Trosh leader, Kimoreth, had sent them to determine whether the rumors were true. And now, they were poised to find out. As the first scout reached the doorway to Ethan's room, he hesitated, his limbs stiffening as he saw the human sleeping so peacefully. The Trosh warrior's mandibles twitched. The tension was unbearable. They'd seen the Federation soldiers break. They had seen them retreat. But this was beyond their comprehension. And then, just as the scout was about to move closer, something strange happened. Ethan stirred, not with alarm, not with fear. He yawned. This continues the build-up, emphasizing the growing legend of Ethan and the impact of his unshakable calm on both his allies and enemies. The Trosh are beginning to feel a mix of confusion and dread, not yet fully understanding the nature of this human. The Trosh scout froze, caught in a strange moment of indecision. Ethan Ward, still sprawled across his cot, stretched lazily. His eyes fluttered open, as though he were just waking up from a restful nap rather than being in the middle of a war zone. He blinked once, then twice, glancing around with the disorienting confusion of someone who had been abruptly yanked from a dream. The Trosh warrior tensed, ready to strike. But Ethan, oblivious to the danger, yawned again, rubbed his eyes, and turned over onto his side, as though he were settling back into bed. "Hell," the scout muttered under his breath, barely audible. He couldn't understand it. He had witnessed countless warriors, from his own kind and others, behave with a near-paranoid awareness of their surroundings. Yet here was this human, completely unaware, acting like nothing in the universe could touch him. Ethan muttered to himself, his voice muffled by the cot. "Guess I overslept." The scout, unsure of how to react, remained still for a moment longer before pulling back. This human, this Deathworlder, was more dangerous than Kimoreth had realized. But what was even more unnerving was that Ethan seemed to have no concept of fear. It wasn't even arrogance or bravado. It was pure indifference. Outside the compound, the rest of the Trosh assault team, led by Kimoreth himself, was closing in. The warlord had decided to see the human for himself, to end the myth once and for all. His forces, carefully positioned in their battle lines, waited for the signal to attack. But now, Kimoreth's hesitation became apparent. His warband was set to crush the Federation defenders, but the sight of Ethan, the sleeping titan, was beginning to gnaw at him. A creeping sense of unease spread among the Trosh ranks, something the warlord had never felt before. They weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting a concept, a force of will that seemed to transcend the battlefield. Kimoreth barked an order, and his troops advanced. But this time, the mood had shifted. It was no longer about strategy or strength. It was about something deeper, something terrifying, the fear of the unknown. This continuation intensifies the psychological battle between Ethan's calm and the Crosh's mounting confusion and fear. Ethan's indifference to danger begins to affect the Crosh on a deeper level, shaking their confidence and foreshadowing a psychological shift in the battle ahead. The air outside the compound was thick with the sound of approaching war machines, the grinding of Troshwalkers, the clatter of their battle cannons charging. Inside, the Federation soldiers huddled behind their defensive positions, preparing for the worst. But even as their nerves tightened, all eyes kept drifting back to Ethan Ward, who still lay slumped on his cot, seemingly unaware of the danger just outside the walls. Lieutenant Taylor crouched beside Sergeant Sullivan, his face set in a grim line. "I don't like this," he muttered. "They're closing in too fast." Sullivan adjusted his rifle, his eyes flicking to Ethan. "Yeah, well, we don't have a choice now. Either we stand and fight, or we die." Maybe Ward's got the right idea. Just sleep through the whole thing. "That's not what I'm worried about," Taylor replied, his voice low. "I'm worried about what happens when they finally figure out they can't break us. What happens when they come after him?" Sullivan shook his head. "No one can kill him. Not when he's like this." Taylor didn't seem so sure, but the conversation was interrupted by the sound of a massive X-Rosh walker thundering toward the compound's entrance. Its legs were like metal towers, shaking the earth with every step. The Trosh were close, closer than ever. Outside, Comoreth stood at the head of his forces, watching his troops take their positions. His mandibles clicked nervously. He had always prided himself on being the most fearsome warlord in the galaxy, but Ethan Ward was starting to gnaw at his confidence. He had seen the human take out an entire X-Rosh ambush without flinching. He had watched as the human slept through artillery fire, chemical warfare, and worse. And now, the thought that a single human soldier could be the key to their defeat was starting to burrow into his mind like a parasite. "Move out," Comoreth barked, rallying his forces. "We'll crush them, all of them. This time, nothing stops us." But as they charged toward the compound, something felt different. Ethan wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a symbol, one that had infected their minds, turning the tide before the first shot was even fired. This part pushes the growing tension to a breaking point, focusing on the mounting pressure felt by both sides. The Trosh are now actively confronting their fear of Ethan's indifference to danger, while the Federation soldiers are starting to feel the weight of an impending battle where everything hinges on their ability to hold firm. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the Trosh warlord, Comoreth, led his forces through the wreckage of the compound's outer defenses. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of ozone from the barrage of artillery fire that had already been unleashed. The Federation soldiers were dug in, but they were severely outnumbered. No matter how tough the human defenders were, Comoreth was sure that this time they couldn't withstand the full might of the Trosh assault. "Prepare to breach," Comoreth commanded, his voice cutting through the noise of the battlefield. His shock troops, heavily armed with plasma rifles and powered exoskeletons, moved forward, their boots thudding against the cracked earth. Behind them, the massive walkers loomed, their legs stomping with mechanical precision. But Comoreth wasn't just focused on the battle. His eyes darted around, searching for the one anomaly that had been bothering him since the beginning of this campaign. Ethan Ward. The human soldier had become more than just a nuisance. He was a symbol of something the Trosh could not understand. A force of will. A mortal who defied the very laws of fear and war. The stories had spread across the Trosh ranks. The legend of the human who slept through the most harrowing battles, who walked into danger without hesitation, who fought with a cold, unyielding calm. And it was that legend that had begun to unravel Comoreth's confidence. As the Trosh forces advanced, the compound's last line of defense, a series of hastily erected barricades, began to buckle under the weight of the attack. But Comoreth wasn't watching the breach. He was focused on the interior of the command post, where he had heard the rumors that Ward had taken refuge. "Move in," Comoreth growled, motioning for his closest officers. "We'll deal with the human first." With his warriors surrounding the building, Comoreth entered the compound, his massive frame looming in the doorway. Inside, Ethan lay on his cot, still as ever. Human. Comoreth's voice boomed, his mandibles clicking in anger. Wake up. Face your death. But Ethan didn't stir. Comoreth's bloodshot eyes narrowed. You think this is funny? You dare ignore me? And yet, in response, Ethan simply yawned. This part focuses on Comoreth's growing obsession with Ethan and his determination to face the human warrior, despite the mounting pressure on the battlefield. It further amplifies the psychological battle, with Ethan's unshakable calm becoming the center of Comoreth's unraveling. Comoreth's patience was wearing thin. He had watched the human soldiers sleep through the most intense bombardments, ignored his force's desperate attempts to gauge his weakness, and yet here he was, standing in the heart of the battlefield, facing him with nothing more than a yawn. Comoreth's rage twisted in his chest. No warrior, no creature, should be so unmoved by war. You think you can defy me? Comoreth roared, his voice reverberating off the walls of the compound. His eyes narrowed into slits, his multi-limbed form towering over Ethan's cot. But Ethan, still lying there with his arms crossed behind his head, seemed utterly unbothered. Slowly, he opened his eyes and met Comoreth's furious gaze with something that could only be described as mild interest. Well, that's a hell of a wake-up call, Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse from sleep. He stretched lazily, as if he hadn't just been surrounded by an army of terrifying hostile aliens. You must be Comoreth, right? Heard a lot about you. What's the deal, big guy? You don't like being ignored. The audacity of it. This puny human, so small compared to Comoreth's imposing form, unimpressed by his fury, was almost too much to bear. Comoreth raised his massive weapon, his eyes burning with a deep primal anger. This ends now, human, he snarled. You and your pathetic resistance. I will crush you. But before he could make a move, something strange happened. The Trosh warlord's keen senses, honed over centuries of conflict, suddenly flared with danger. There was a faint creak in the floor beneath him, the sound of something clicking into place. Comoreth's instincts screamed at him to move, but it was too late. In a blur, the floor beneath the warlord erupted in a cascade of bright sparks, as an explosive charge detonated underneath his feet. The blast sent Comoreth crashing backward, his massive frame crumpling under the force of the explosion. His warband, caught off guard, scrambled for cover as the Federation soldiers, led by Lieutenant Taylor and Sergeant Sullivan, surged forward with renewed ferocity. Comoreth roared in pain and fury as he struggled to rise, but the damage was done. The human soldier's influence had once again shifted the tides of battle. Ethan Ward hadn't needed to lift a finger. He had fought his way into victory. Ethan, finally sitting up in his cot, glanced at the carnage unfolding around him. Guess I'll get back to my nap now. This part focuses on the moment when Comoreth's overconfidence is shattered and Ethan's strategy, even while asleep, turns the tide of the battle. Ethan's seemingly effortless manipulation of the situation demonstrates his brilliance, while also highlighting his eerie calm in the face of overwhelming odds. The psychological warfare continues to take its toll on the Trosh. The compound was a chaotic storm of smoke, debris, and gunfire. Trosh warriors, their movements erratic and disorganized after Comoreth's fall, struggled to regroup. The once mighty warlord was on the ground, his body half crushed beneath the rubble of the explosion, his powerful limbs twitching in futile defiance. Ethan Ward, still seated on his cot, brushed dust off his uniform with an almost casual air, as though this were just another day for him. The Federation soldiers, seeing their chance, surged forward with renewed fury. They had been pushed to the brink. But now, thanks to the mysterious human who had so effortlessly disrupted their enemies, they were fighting with the strength of 1,000 men. Sergeant Sullivan, his voice hoarse with adrenaline, barked orders to his team as they pushed through the smoke. Take them down. We've got them on the ropes now. Comoreth's remaining officers, struggling to maintain control of their scattered forces, tried to rally their troops. But their confidence had been shattered. They had underestimated the human warrior. And now it was clear. It wasn't just Ethan's skill or strength that made him dangerous. It was his mind, his unshakable ability to bend the battlefield itself to his will. As the battle raged on, Comoreth, bloody but not broken, slowly began to rise, his mandibles hissing in rage. He reached for his weapon, determined to end this charade once and for all. But then a shadow fell over him. Ethan, now standing with a rifle in his hands, stepped forward from the smoke. His gaze was sharp, focused. The sound of his boots hitting the floor was the only thing that could be heard over the carnage. Comoreth looked up, and for a moment, the warlord's arrogance flickered. You think you've won." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he simply raised the rifle and leveled it at the Krosh leader's chest. "No, big guy," Ethan said, his voice calm but cutting through the noise like a knife. "I know I've won." With a single pull of the trigger, the warlord crumpled to the ground, his body falling limp, his final breath lost in the chaos. The Krosh forces, without their leader, began to retreat, their morale shattered completely. The Federation soldiers surged forward, taking advantage of the disarray. As the last of the Krosh crawled away, Taylor stood over Ethan, shaking his head in disbelief. You really just slept through all that?" Ethan wiped the dirt from his brow and shrugged. "Well, I did get a good nap in, but it looks like the battle's over. Now, let's go have a drink. I'm starving." Taylor couldn't help but laugh, even as the blood of the battlefield soaked into the ground around them. The human soldier, the Deathworlder who slept through war itself, had once again proven that when it came to survival, the Krosh had no idea what they were up against. This final part wraps up the conflict with Ethan's strategic brilliance and unshakable calm having turned the tide in a near impossible situation. The battle ends with a shift in momentum and a dramatic conclusion, highlighting Ethan's role as a symbol of unyielding strength and mind-over-matter determination, cementing his place as a legend among both his allies and enemies.